Silver eyes. That is what the court remembers first. Not her name, not her rank. Not the borrowed gown, or the borrowed shoes, or the careful downward angle of her gaze as she walked into the grand mating hall. They remember the silver the way it flooded into her pale gray irises like moonlight entering still water. Unstoppable and absolute, at the exact moment the rejection mark was pressed to her skin. They remember the silence that followed. And they remember her voice steady and resonant, and entirely not her own naming the traitor standing 7 feet from the king before anyone in that hall had processed what they were looking at. She had been laughed at 30 seconds before. The laughter did not survive what came next. Which country are you listening from right now? Please drop it in the comments below. I would love to know how far this story has traveled. The trick was in the angle. Lyra had perfected it by the time she was 11 years old, a precise, calculated downward tilt of her head that made her appear submissive, unassuming, appropriately deferential, while actually being a sophisticated piece of self-preservation engineering. She did not look at the floor because she was ashamed. She looked at the floor because she had learned, through specific and costly experience, that sustained eye contact with another person was the fastest way to have her life destroyed. 20 years of maintenance. 20 years of calibration. The angle had to be low enough to prevent accidental direct contact, but not so low that it attracted the particular attention people gave to the visibly broken. There was a sweet spot between invisible and pitiable, and Lyra had lived in it for 2 decades with the specific discipline of someone whose survival depended on the precision of a single daily performance. She lived in the outer districts of Kareth, in the 3-room dwelling attached to the back of Marin's healing practice. Marin was 64, sharp-tempered, genuinely skilled, and the closest thing to family Lyra had. She knew about the gift in the way that people who lived closely with someone knew things without being told directly. She had noticed the eye management, had noticed the way Lyra always positioned herself in rooms so that her face was slightly angled away from whoever was speaking, had noticed that Lyra never described people in terms of their obvious qualities, but in terms of something more interior and accurate that made Marin occasionally uncomfortable. She had never asked Lyra to explain it. Lyra had never offered. This was the foundation of their arrangement, and it had worked for 8 years. The work itself was straightforward. Lyra prepared remedies, maintained the supply records, managed the patient intake, assisted with the minor procedures that Marin's aging hands had begun to find difficult. She was good at the work. She was good at all work that required attention and precision and the ability to remain invisible, in a room full of people who were paying attention to something other than her. She was less good at markets. Markets required movement through dense crowds, which required constant management, the angle, the peripheral awareness, the specific internal discipline of not responding to the glimpses the gift gave her when proximity became unavoidable. In a crowd, she received fragments constantly, not full readings, not the overwhelming silver-eyed flood of a complete fate thread, but slivers, a flash of someone's immediate future here, a fragment of someone's true nature there, the emotional residue of a decision recently made drifting off a passing shoulder like heat off stone. She had learned to process these without expression, to absorb them and set them aside, to let them pass through her the way background noise passed through a skilled musician who was practicing something more important. Last autumn, at the Eastern Market, she had turned a corner too quickly and walked directly into the chest of the district tax collector. The collision was minor. The eye contact that followed, his face 2 feet from hers, his hand on her arm to steady her, his direct, surprised gaze meeting hers for the 2 seconds before she managed to look away, was not minor. She got 3 weeks of his future in a flash, a specific lie he would tell, the person who would catch him in it, and the exact expression on his face when his career ended. She spent 2 hours behind the market's grain storage building waiting for the nausea to pass. She did not tell anyone what she had seen. He was caught in the lie 6 weeks later, exactly as she had seen it. And she felt nothing in particular about this except the familiar, exhausted resignation of someone for whom this was simply the way the world operated. The mating ceremony was not her idea. Lena, who ran the bread stall 3 streets over from the healing practice and had known Lyra for years and meant well in the specific way of people who could not understand that their good intentions were not the point, had submitted Lyra's name to the ceremony registry 2 weeks before the late registration cutoff. She had done this, she explained when confronted, because the stipend paid to attending candidates was 12 silver crowns, which was exactly what Marin's roof repair would cost. And she had heard that even candidates who were not selected received the full stipend. And she had not seen any reason why Lyra should not participate, since the worst that could happen was that she did not get selected and came home with 12 silver crowns. Lyra had stood in the bread stall doorway looking at Lena with an expression that Lena later described as the most frightening look she had ever received from a person who was not technically doing anything threatening. She had not been able to withdraw the registration. The late-stage process did not permit withdrawals. She had spent 2 weeks constructing a strategy. The strategy was: arrive, keep her eyes down absolutely, be formally processed, receive the stipend, leave. The ceremony involved each candidate being presented to the king and assessed for compatibility. The assessment was brief, perhaps 3 minutes per candidate, conducted at a distance. No physical contact except the compatibility mark process at the end, which was a formality, given the practical impossibility of a low-ranking Omega being selected by the king himself. The mark was pressed, the formal rejection was recorded, the candidate received her stipend and departed. 3 minutes. She could manage 3 minutes. She had worn Marin's second-best dress, which was not a perfect fit, but was appropriate in fabric and color. Marin had adjusted the hem that morning without asking why Lyra needed it adjusted. The palace was larger than she had allowed herself to imagine. She had built a scaled-down version of it in her planning. A manageable space she could navigate through without being overwhelmed, and the actual palace was not that. It was tall and formal, and full of people who moved with the specific confidence of those who had always been exactly where they belonged. And Lyra moved through it with her eyes angled precisely downward, and her hands folded in front of her, and the absolute internal stillness she had spent 20 years developing. The anteroom where the candidates waited was warm. 11 women before her, all better dressed, all higher ranked. All carrying the specific composure of people who had prepared for this with genuine hope. Lyra sat at the room's far edge and studied the floor tiles. A court official moved through the room collecting names and processing paperwork. When he reached Lyra, he grabbed her arm to turn her toward him, a casual, thoughtless gesture, and her head came up reflexively in the surprise of the contact, and her eyes met his for a moment before she could manage the angle. 3 weeks of his future. She processed it behind a perfectly still face, set it aside, looked back at the tiles. The anteroom door opened. Her name was called last. She stood in the anteroom doorway for 3 seconds before she made herself move. 3 seconds was not long. Long enough to register the scale of the mating hall, through the open door, the vaulted ceiling, the assembled alphas along both walls. The raised platform at the far end where the king sat with the particular stillness of someone who had been performing authority for long enough that it had stopped requiring effort. Long enough to count the distance between the entrance and the platform and calculate how many seconds of managed walking it would take to cross it. Long enough to remind herself, eyes down, angle maintained, 3 minutes, stipend, home. She crossed into the hall. The memory she was trying not to have arrived anyway. The way memories did when the body was under stress and the gift was hovering at the surface, activated by proximity and unease. She had learned that she could not prevent the memories from coming, only from overtaking her in the moment they arrived. She let it come and kept walking. She had been 9 years old the first time the gift activated fully. The village elder's name was Torval. He was 60 years old, well regarded. The kind of man who stood at the center of communal decisions with the easy authority of someone who had occupied that position so long he had forgotten it was a position rather than a natural state. He had come to speak at the harvest celebration, which was the largest gathering the village held each year. And 9-year-old Lyra had been in the crowd with her parents and her younger brother. And when Torvald spoke and the crowd turned their faces toward him, Lyra had turned toward him too, because she had not yet learned not to. Because no one had told her there was anything to manage. Because for 9 years the thing that happened, when she looked directly at people, had been happening at a level she could not yet identify as separate from the ordinary way of perceiving the world. Torvald spoke his opening sentence, and Lyra looked at him, and the silver came. She had not known it was silver. She could not see her own eyes. She only knew that suddenly she could see his fate thread with extraordinary, crystalline clarity, not a vague impression, not a feeling, but a specific and detailed sequence of events laid out before her like a map she had not asked to read, but could not stop reading now that it was open. She saw the harvest yield numbers he had falsified for 3 years. She saw the specific arrangement he had made with 2 council members. She saw the illness that was going to take him the following winter. She could see the winter, the specific quality of the cold, the specific room, and she saw the way this illness was going to resolve a debt he had been carrying for 20 years, which she could not understand except as the feeling of something coming right after being wrong for a very long time. And she said all of it, aloud, in a voice that the adults around her would later describe as not quite her own, too steady, too resonant, too precisely enunciated for a 9-year-old's mouth. She said it the way a reader read from a page, not performing but transmitting. And she said all of it before anyone could process what was happening quickly enough to stop her. The crowd turned from Torvald to her. Torvald turned from the crowd to her. She stopped when the thread reached its natural end, when there was simply nothing more to say, and the silver left her eyes, and she stood in the crowd with the aftermath headache beginning behind her temples and looked at the sea of faces looking at her, and did not understand yet what she had done. She understood it within the hour. Her parents understood it faster than she did. The word that moved through the village was demon, not which implied a skill, a choice, a power directed with intention. Demon implied possession, contamination, something that had gotten into a child who had previously been ordinary. Her parents were not cruel people, but they were frightened people. And frightened people made decisions based on the speed of their fear rather than the quality of their thinking, and the decision they made was made by nightfall. The healer woman who found her was not Marin. That came later. The healer woman who found her was an elderly widow named Sova who lived at the village's edge and had a reputation for eccentricity and a complete indifference to the opinion of the crowd that Lyra would only understand much later as a form of hard-won freedom. Sova had watched the harvest celebration from the distance she always maintained from such events, had watched what happened, and had come to find Lyra sitting alone at the village well after the crowd dispersed and her parents made their decision. Sova had said, "Can you do that again?" Lyra had said, "I don't know. I don't want to." Sova had said, "Then we will work on the wanting." She had lived with Sova for 6 years. Sova had taught her everything she knew about the gift, which was not much in terms of mechanics. Because Sova did not have the gift herself, but was considerable in terms of management. The angle, the peripheral awareness, the specific internal discipline of processing the fragments without reacting to them. The differentiation between a glimpse, which was manageable, and a full reading, which was not. The understanding that the full reading was activated by 2 specific conditions: sustained eye contact, and what Sova called urgency, the quality of a fate thread that was about to produce something significant, something that the gift apparently assessed as needing to be said whether or not the vessel for saying it agreed. Sova had also taught her the cost, not in abstract terms but practically, empirically, from careful observation of every activation Lyra experienced over 6 years. Minor glimpses left her nauseated for an hour or two. Brief uncontrolled readings, 3 to 5 minutes, produced headaches that lasted a full day, and a blurring of peripheral vision that persisted for 2 to 3 days. A full reading of the length she had produced at the harvest celebration left her unconscious for 6 to 8 hours and produced vision effects that lasted 5 to 7 days, including a specific inability to read fine print that she had never recovered from entirely. There was one reading between the harvest celebration and the mating ceremony that Lyra had allowed voluntarily. She had been 17. His name was Dale, a young man from the town where Sova lived, the son of a wheelwright. Curious and kind, and entirely ordinary in the specific way that ordinariness becomes remarkable when a person has lived surrounded by fear and superstition. He had wanted to understand her. She had wanted, for perhaps the first and last time in her adolescence, to be understood. She had let him look at her directly. She had seen his fate thread in full the complete shape of his life. The futures available to him from the branch point of that exact moment. None of the futures were bad, precisely. One of them included her, and most of them did not. And the one that included her was not the one that led to his greatest happiness, and she had not told him any of this. She had told him only what she had seen about a choice he was facing about whether to leave the town, a small, practical thing, not the large things, and she had said it gently and accurately, and he had thanked her, and he had left. Not because of what she told him, but because the choice she had named was the choice that took him away from the town. And she had seen that was coming, and had named it anyway because it was true. She had closed her eyes properly the next time someone tried to look at her, and she had not opened them since. Not until the mating hall. She was halfway across the hall's floor when she became aware of the whispers beginning. She processed them without adjusting her gaze. She was being assessed, which was expected. The whispers were perhaps slightly amused, which she had also anticipated. She kept walking at a measured pace, counting the steps remaining between her and the platform, maintaining the angle with the absolute discipline of 20 years. She heard the laughter at 12 steps out. Not cruel laughter, which might paradoxically have been easier to absorb because cruelty was predictable. It was the light, performative laughter of a man demonstrating his own perceptiveness to an audience. A king showing his court that he could read a situation quickly and accurately and find it mildly amusing. It said, "I have assessed this and found it not worth serious attention." She kept walking. 8 steps. 6. 4. The master of ceremonies announced the rejection mark as a formality, which was accurate. The pressed mark was a physical act, a stamp of formal process, nothing more. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It hurt more than she expected. Her head came up. Her eyes met the king's. She did not intend it. In 20 years of management, in 20 years of angle and discipline, and the practiced downward cast of a gaze that never wavered, she had not once made this mistake. But the mark's pain cracked something in the careful architecture she had built, and her head came up by reflex rather than choice. And for one unguarded second her pale gray eyes found his across the 12 feet of marble floor between them. The silver came before she could look away. She had half a second of awareness before the gift took the wheel, entirely half a second in which she understood what was happening with the resigned clarity of someone who has spent 20 years preventing exactly this, and has just watched the prevention fail. She felt her eyes change. She felt her voice begin its preparation in her throat, that specific resonant quality settling into her larynx like a tuning fork finding its frequency. She felt the fate threads of everyone in the room become visible to her simultaneously, a sudden overwhelming abundance of information. And then the gift sorted through them with its own logic, its own priority system, its own assessment of what was urgent and what was not. What was urgent was 7 feet to the king's left. Lord Varen's fate thread was blazing. Her voice came without her permission, as it always did. Steady and resonant, and entirely too loud for a room that had just been filled with performative laughter. She said, "Lord Varen, commander of the Royal Security Council, has been funding the Eastern Network's assassination infrastructure from the Crown's own reserve accounts for 31 months. The payment scheduled for transfer 3 days from today will fund the operation targeting this hall during the Autumn Council convening. The courier is already in the city. His name is Edric Thorne, and he is carrying documentation that connects this network to a foreign principal whose name I will speak if Lord Varen does not step away from the king immediately." The hall went silent. Not the gradual silence of a crowd processing something surprising. The immediate, absolute silence of a room in which everyone understood simultaneously that something had changed so fundamentally that all prior activity was irrelevant. Lord Varen did not step away from the king. He stood with the specific frozen quality of a man whose face was performing composure while every other signal his body produced told a different story entirely. His hands were still. His face was still. His eyes were not still. They moved toward the exits in a sequence that the gift showed Lyra, even as she watched it happen in real time, calculating, assessing, measuring the distance between his current position and every available exit, determining whether speed or composure was the better strategy. She was already reading the next thread before she could stop it. The Alpha standing at the hall's eastern wall, Lord Fenwick. She did not know his name, and the gift supplied it had been receiving intelligence from Varen's network for 14 months, not funding it, receiving, which made him a different category of participant, but a participant nonetheless. She said this. She said the specific intelligence he had received, the specific decisions he had made based on it, the specific meeting in the 3rd month of last year in which the arrangement had been formalized. Lord Fenwick sat down. There was no chair behind him. He sat down on the floor. 2 more readings followed, both briefer, both connected to Varen's network in subsidiary ways, financial rather than operational. The supporting structure of something she was beginning to understand was considerably larger than a single assassination plot. She spoke what she saw. The gift was not selective, and she was not directing it. It moved through the room's urgent fate threads with the systematic efficiency of a fire consuming available fuel, going where the urgency was highest and not stopping until it was done. Then it turned toward the king. She had one moment of desperate internal negotiation, the gift's version of a negotiation, which was to say she presented every argument she had for why this was not necessary, and the gift weighed them against its own assessment of urgency and made its decision. The king's fate thread was not urgent in the way Varen's had been. There was no imminent physical danger, no scheduled transaction, no courier already in the city. But there was something the gift assessed as significant, a branch point, a place in the thread where 2 futures diverged substantially, where the direction taken in the next several days would produce outcomes that were very different from each other. She did not read his fate. She read his nature. She said, "This king's most significant capacity is the quality of his attention, which is exceptional when he chooses to use it and destructive when he directs it toward performance instead of truth. He has not looked at what is actually in this room for 3 years. What he has mistaken for discernment is speed of conclusion. They are different things. The fate thread branches at the point where he chooses to understand this distinction." She stopped because the thread reached its natural end, and there was nothing more the gift assessed as urgent. And the silence that followed was the deepest silence she had ever produced in a room, which was considerable given that she had produced her first at a harvest celebration at the age of 9. Then the gift's cost arrived. It arrived the way it always arrived, not gradually, but all at once, as though the body had been waiting with professional patience for the gift to complete its work before presenting its invoice. The headache came first, white and absolute behind her eyes, the specific searing quality of a full reading's aftermath pressing outward from the center of her skull. Then the vision affects the peripheral world blurring, the distance between her and the platform becoming uncertain, the marble floor's pattern dissolving into an abstract shimmer. Her knees gave. She was aware, in the half-second before she lost the ability to track her own position, of movement on the platform. The king was on his feet. He was moving not away, which would have been the instinct of a man who had just been publicly read by a gift he had not known existed, but toward her, which was not what she expected, which was the last thing she processed before the floor came up and the silver left her eyes and the hall went fully dark. The last fragment of awareness she retained before unconsciousness took her was the specific sound of 12 feet of marble floor traversed at speed, and the particular quality of someone's hands reaching for her, certain, immediate, not hesitant at all, and the thought, distant and fading, that she had never in 20 years of falling alone been caught before. She woke to ceiling. High ceiling, stone vaulted, the particular architectural grammar of a palace's interior spaces, not the low timber of Marin's healing practice. Not the plaster of her own room, something considerably grander and considerably less familiar. She lay still for a moment, taking inventory of herself the way she always did after a full reading. The headache, which was present and substantial, but had downgraded from the initial white searing quality to a deep persistent ache that she knew from experience would last the full day. The vision, which was blurred at the periphery in the specific way of gift aftermath. The edges of the room soft and indistinct while the immediate center held reasonable clarity. Her hands, which were slightly cold. Her body, which felt wrung out and hollow in the particular way of something that had given significantly more than it had available to give. She had been unconscious for 9 hours, the palace healer told her when she asked. The healer was a compact, precise woman named Sarah, who conducted her examination with the efficient thoroughness of someone who had been doing this work for a long time and did not require performance of either distress or recovery from her patients. She checked Lyra's eyes. The silver was gone, back to its natural pale gray, which Lyra, confirmed by the healer's lack of reaction, checked her pulse, checked the sensitivity of her vision by passing a lamp at various distances. She reported her findings in the calm, matter-of-fact tone of a professional delivering data rather than narrative. 9 hours unconscious. Vision effects present and expected to persist for 4 to 5 days. Headache consistent with a full reading. No other injuries from the fall. She had been caught before hitting the floor. She had been moved to the medical wing and kept under observation throughout. Lord Varon had been taken into custody within minutes of the reading. 3 other individuals she had named were under investigation. The king had not left the medical wing. Lyra processed this last piece of information separately from the others. She said, "I see." The healer said, "He has been in that room since you were brought in." She nodded toward the door that connected the examination room to an adjacent chamber. "He asked to be informed when you woke." She paused with the specific pause of a person deciding whether to add something. Then she added, "He has also asked me to tell you that you are under palace protection and not under palace detention." Welcome back to the Whispers of Alpha King channel. Today we're going to present a new story that I believe you'll be very curious about and interested in because of its incredibly captivating content. Now let's explore it together until the end of the video. This is a fictional story compiled from various sources, supported by AI, and the content is purely for entertainment and educational purposes. The distinction is yours to make. Lyra sat up carefully. The room cooperated with this better than she expected. She put her feet on the floor and waited for the world to confirm it was stable, and found that it was approximately stable enough. She said, "How long has he been there?" The healer said, "Since they brought you in." 9 hours. Lyra looked at the connecting door for a moment. She thought about what it meant that a king had spent 9 hours in a chair in a medical annex, waiting for a woman he had publicly dismissed 30 seconds before she dismantled his court's sense of its own security. She thought about what it meant that he had asked the healer to specify the distinction between protection and detention. She thought about the branch point she had seen in his fate thread, before the gift gave her the specific assessment of his nature, the diverging futures. The significant difference between them, and she thought about the half-second of something she had processed on the floor before unconsciousness took her. The particular quality of hands that reached without hesitation. She crossed to the connecting door and opened it. The room was small and simply furnished a chair, a side table with a lamp. A narrow window showing the deep blue of very late night or very early morning. King Aldrich was in the chair. He was not asleep. He was sitting in the specific way of someone who had been sitting for a long time and had stopped performing any particular posture. Back not quite straight, one forearm on the chair's arm, looking at nothing specific and not bothering to correct this when the door opened. He looked different without the platform and the ceremony and the court's assembled attention between them. Not smaller, he was a large man, and rooms did not diminish him, but more specific. The general impression of a king had resolved into a particular person in a chair who had been awake for longer than was comfortable and had chosen to remain so. His eyes found hers when she entered. She managed the angle before the gift could take the contact as an invitation. She looked at the bridge of his nose, a technique Sova had taught her. Close enough to read as direct engagement from the other person's perspective. Far enough from the eyes to prevent the fate thread activation. She had used it for 20 years in situations where complete avoidance was impossible. He said, "You are awake." She said, "Yes." He said, "How much of what I am about to ask you can you actually answer right now?" She considered this honestly. She said, "More than you might expect. The headache is present, but my reasoning is intact." He said, "Then I have a great number of questions." She said, "I expect you do." He said, "But first," and he stopped, and she watched him decide something. And whatever he decided produced a slight change in his expression that she could see even through blurred peripheral vision. "First, are you in pain?" She looked at him for a moment with the specific attention of someone who had spent 20 years watching what people said against what they meant, and found, with the mild disorientation of genuine surprise, that the question was entirely what it appeared to be. She said, "Yes. It will pass." He nodded once, accepting this, and said nothing further about it, which she found she respected more than any response that would have required her to reassure him. He asked his questions in order of importance. She noticed this immediately, not the diplomatic ordering of someone managing an interrogation, not the political ordering of someone protecting a narrative, but the practical ordering of a man who had spent a sleepless night ranking his questions by urgency and was working through the list from the top. She found it, against her expectations, somewhat reassuring. A person who ordered their questions by what actually mattered was at minimum trying to understand something real. He asked, "Can she read anyone's fate at will?" She said, "No. The full reading requires 2 conditions. Sustained direct eye contact, not a glance, not peripheral contact, but genuine sustained lock, and what she called urgency. The gift has its own assessment of which fate threads are urgent enough to require speaking. She does not direct this assessment. It has never once consulted her preferences." He absorbed this without visible reaction and moved to the next question. He asked, "Can she read his fate at will?" She said she had already read a portion of it at the ceremony. Not because she chose to, but because the gift assessed the branch point in his immediate future as significant. She read his nature rather than his specific fate, because his nature was what the urgency was about. He said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means the gift told you what you were rather than what you would do. Because what you were is the thing that determines which future you move toward." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What did you see about what I am?" She looked at her hands, which were resting on the medical wing blanket someone had placed over her legs, and said, she had told him in the hall. She did not see a reason to soften the repetition. She said, he had a significant capacity for attention that he had been directing at performance rather than truth. She said, She had seen this as the central determinant of which branch his fate thread took from the point of the ceremony forward. He said, "And which branch requires me to direct it at truth?" She said, "The better one." He said, "Better for whom?" She said, "Everyone in the kingdom who depends on the accuracy of your judgment, which is everyone in the kingdom." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable exactly. It had the quality of a silence being used productively, which was a different thing. She watched him from the periphery of her careful non-gaze, and saw him sit with what she had said without deflecting it or explaining it away. And this was sufficiently unusual in her experience of how people received accurate assessments of themselves that she filed it carefully. He asked about Lord Varen's network, what she had seen, how much detail the reading had produced, whether she could recover the full information again, or whether the reading was single use. She explained, the information was in her memory completely, as it always was after a full reading. She could not reread Varen now because the gift did not repeat readings of the same person's fate thread once seen. The thread was known, and the gift had no urgency about reviewing already known information. She could, however, write down everything she had seen during the reading, and it would be accurate in every particular. He said he would want that as soon as she was able to produce it. She said she would begin tonight if he left her a lamp and writing materials. He said she should wait until morning, and he would arrange for everything she needed. They looked at each other, she through her careful peripheral management, he directly. With the quality of attention she had read in his fate thread, and was now observing operating in real time. He was looking at her in the specific way of someone who has recently discovered that they missed something important and is attempting to understand how the missing happened. She found this simultaneously easier and more difficult to manage than contempt would have been. He said, "I need you to stay and help me find what Varen's network has hidden. The readings you can provide are the only tool I currently have that the network cannot anticipate or counter." He said, "I am asking, not ordering. You are here under protection, not detention, and that distinction is real." He said, "I also understand if the answer is no. Because what I am describing will cost you significantly, and I did not earn the right to ask it 36 hours ago." She looked at her hands. She thought about Varen's fate thread, and the courier already in the city, and the operation scheduled for the autumn council convening. And she thought about accuracy and urgency, and the gift's own assessment of what needed to be said. She said, "I will consider it," which meant she had already decided. But she had never in her life had the experience of being asked rather than used. And she intended to sit with it for at least a few hours before she gave it away. 3 days after waking, Lyra had a room, a writing desk, a lamp, and the most uncomfortable arrangement she had ever occupied. The room was in the palace's east residential wing, a guest chamber designed for minor visiting dignitaries, which meant it was the size of Marin's entire healing practice, had 2 windows overlooking a garden she had not yet visited, and contained furniture whose quality she was trying not to think about too carefully, because thinking about it produced an awareness of the distance between this room and her actual life that was not useful at present. She had written out the full contents of the ceremony reading on the first night, 12 pages in her small precise hand. Every name and date and transaction she had seen in Varen's fate thread, laid out with the systematic thoroughness that 20 years of healer's apprentice record-keeping had made automatic. She had handed it to Aldrich the following morning, and watched him read it in silence, and then read it again, and had observed, without comment, the specific quality of expression that moved across his face during the second reading. Not shock, he had moved past shock, but the particular controlled weight of a man discovering that the shape of a betrayal was considerably larger than the initial exposure had suggested. Lord Varen was in custody. 3 others were under preliminary investigation. Lord Fenwick, who had sat down on the floor of the mating hall, had since cooperated extensively with the investigators in the specific way of a man who understood that his best available outcome depended entirely on the quality of his cooperation. The two subsidiary network participants she had read were being handled through the palace's internal security process. What the written record could not produce, the investigations required in person. The first interrogation was conducted in the palace's eastern interview chamber, a formal space, well lit. 3 investigators present plus palace counsel plus Aldrich standing at the room's far wall in the position of someone who was present but not directing. Lyra sat across from one of the subsidiary participants she had named at the ceremony. She explained the process to the investigators beforehand. She would make eye contact with the subject at a duration she controlled. The reading would be brief, she would not allow it to go to full activation. Would manage the contact duration to produce confirmation of specific information rather than full fate thread exposure. The cost would be a manageable headache rather than a full collapse. She said this with the matter-of-fact precision of a healer explaining a procedure. And the investigators received it with the particular careful neutrality of people who were trying very hard to process something their professional frameworks had not previously accommodated. She sat across from the subject and looked at him for 6 seconds. 6 seconds was enough. Brief readings at controlled duration produced fragments, rather than full fate threads, targeted information, specific to what the gift assessed as relevant to the current urgency. She looked away, sat with the aftermath nausea for a moment, and confirmed 2 specific transactions that the written record had referenced and the investigation needed corroborated. The subject's expression during the 6 seconds was the expression of a person discovering that the thing they had spent months concealing was in the process of being read off them like text from a page. The investigators were very quiet. The second interrogation was the same afternoon, a different subject. Aldrich was present for this one, as he had been for the first. When she finished the brief reading and looked away and absorbed the nausea with her hands flat on the table, she became aware of him watching her from the room's far wall with an attention that was doing something more than cataloging operational data. He was watching the cost. He was watching what the gift extracted from her in exchange for what it produced. And his face was doing the specific thing she had noticed it doing, the quality of attention she had read in his fate thread. The version of him that looked at what was actually present rather than what was convenient to perceive. She said nothing about this. She said, "The second subject confirms the financial routing structure runs through the palace's third-tier discretionary accounts. They will need to look at the archive records." He said, "I will arrange access." She said, "Tonight would be better than tomorrow." He said, "Tonight then." In the afternoon, with the investigation's preliminary phase concluded and the archive access arranged for evening, Lyra moved through the palace's public corridors for the first time with the limited freedom her current status permitted. She kept her eyes managed as always. She processed the fragments the crowds produced as always and set them aside as always. In the East Wing's main corridor, a senior court official passed her going the other direction. Proximity produced the unavoidable fragment, a single flash before she managed the angle. The fragment contained one word. Not a name she expected, not a network connection she had already mapped. A name she recognized from the ceremony's record books, from the list of palace staff she had reviewed when writing her preliminary notes. The palace's head archivist. She walked the rest of the corridor with an entirely neutral expression and the specific internal alertness of someone who had just discovered that the archive she was scheduled to visit that evening was not the neutral resource she had assumed it was. The study was the room Aldrich used when he was not performing anything for anyone. He had 2 private spaces in the palace, the formal private office, which was where he conducted sensitive meetings and which contained the specific furnishings of official seriousness, and the study, which was smaller and less intentional in its arrangement, and which he had gradually, over 20 years, filled with the things that actually interested him, rather than the things that were appropriate to interest a king. Maps. Several hundred of them. in varying states of organization across the two long tables that occupied the room's center. Tactical histories. A collection of astronomical charts that had no practical application to governance and that he had never mentioned to anyone. A running record of the kingdom's water table measurements going back 60 years, which he maintained himself because no one had ever asked him to, and it required sustained attention to a pattern that did not produce visible results, which was the kind of work he found, in the privacy of his own assessment, genuinely satisfying. He had been in the study since the second interrogation ended. It was now the middle of the night. The archive visit had been arranged. He did not yet know what Lyra had found in the east corridor that information would reach him in the morning. What he had was the 12 pages she had written, the 2 interrogations confirmed information, and the map of Varen's network that was taking shape on the study's largest table in his own handwriting, because he needed to understand its structure in spatial terms before he could think clearly about it. He had been staring at the network map for an hour. He was not thinking about the network. He was thinking about the second interrogation. He was thinking about the 6 seconds she had looked at the subject, and the way the subject's face had changed during those 6 seconds, not the dramatic visible distress of someone being physically examined, but the more particular distress of someone watching their carefully maintained concealment dissolve. And then he was thinking about her face immediately after, when she had looked away and placed her hands flat on the table and been very still for 30 seconds while the cost of the brief reading moved through her. He had watched people pay costs before. The kingdom's work required people to pay costs regularly: soldiers in campaigns, diplomats in negotiations, administrators in the accumulated weight of daily institutional complexity. He was not unfamiliar with the image of a person absorbing something difficult and continuing anyway. What was different about watching Lyra was the absence of performance. Every cost he had watched people pay in 20 years of governance had been paid with some degree of awareness of its audience: the soldier, who noted who was watching when he stood despite his injury. The diplomat who ensured her composure was visible to the right people. Not calculation. Necessarily, sometimes simply the automatic awareness of a social animal in a social environment. But present. Lyra's absence of performance was so complete that it had taken him 2 observations to identify it as the thing that was different. She was not modest about the cost or brave about the cost or professionally composed about the cost. She simply bore it, with her hands on the table and her face directed at a neutral point in the room. And then she told him what the reading had produced. And the sequence of those 2 things was entirely consistent whether he was watching or not. He had been watching. He had not been sure until he examined this carefully, whether his watching was cataloging operational data or something else. He examined it carefully now in the study, with the network map spread in front of him and the maps of all the other things on the table around it, and determined that it was not primarily operational. He had looked at what was in front of him, for the first time in what he was increasingly understanding had been several years. He had looked at the 12 pages of her handwriting and seen not the intelligence asset it represented, but the specific evidence of a person who had been recording this kind of information, alone for a very long time, and had learned to do it with extraordinary precision, because precision was the only control available when everything else was outside her management. He had looked at her in the anteroom report from the ceremony's court official, the note about the arm grab, the moment of accidental eye contact, her immediate recovery, and seen a person who had spent 20 years building a specific and sophisticated system of self-protection, and who had deployed it under conditions for which it was entirely inadequate. He thought about the ceremony. He had done this carefully earlier in the evening, and had not done it carefully enough, so he did it again, with more honesty this time. He had laughed at her. Not from cruelty, he did not think he was a cruel man, and this distinction felt increasingly important to examine. He had laughed from the easy, automatic confidence of someone who believed their read of a situation was reliable, and had performed that confidence for an audience, and had been comprehensively and publicly wrong in a way that had been witnessed by every significant figure in his court. Being wrong in private was a private matter. Being wrong in public, at the expense of someone whose value he had dismissed in the performance of his wrongness, was a different category of error. He had used her visible smallness and her borrowed dress and her careful downward gaze as props in a performance of his own discernment. And the discernment he had performed was the opposite of the discernment he possessed. He sat with this for a long time. He did not look for an excuse. He had noticed that his mind offered several the short duration of her presentation, the reasonable inference from available surface data, the precedent of the ceremony's conventional assessment protocol, and he looked at each one and set it aside, because excuses were not the point. Understanding the mechanism of the error was the point. The mechanism was speed of conclusion mistaken for quality of conclusion. He had assessed her in 30 seconds and reached a result his ego had been satisfied with and had not looked further. The thing she had said in the hall, in the silver-eyed voice that was and was not hers, pressed itself back into his attention. The most significant failure of his attention was that he directed it toward performance rather than truth. That the speed of his conclusions was not discernment. That they were different things. He looked at the network map. He looked at the accumulated evidence of 31 months of financial manipulation that had been operating in his court structure. Visible in the data if you looked at the data rather than at the efficient and familiar face of the man presenting it. He had not looked at the data. He had looked at the face. He had done this, he was now determining, in more than the context of Lord Varen. He had done it with consistent regularity, in every area of governance where familiarity had replaced attention. He had assembled a court that told him what he wanted to hear, not because he had asked for that specifically, but because he had never asked for anything else. He closed the network map folder and left the study. He went to find her. She was not in her room. The night guard at the East Wing entrance told him. With the careful neutrality of someone relaying information, they found slightly surprising that she had gone to the archive 40 minutes ago. The Palace Archive occupied the entire lower floor of the East Residential Wing's oldest section, along low-ceilinged space that had been accumulating records for 200 years and had the specific quality of rooms whose primary relationship was with time rather than with the people who occasionally moved through them. It smelled of old parchment and lamp oil, and the particular mineral cold of stone that received very little direct light. Lyra had been inside for 40 minutes, and had not yet lit the second lamp she had brought. She was working in the light of the first, moving through the financial ledgers with the systematic attention of someone who had managed Marin's practice accounts for 8 years and understood, at a level below conscious analysis, the specific texture of accurate record-keeping versus record-keeping that had been arranged to look accurate. They felt different under her hands. She could not have explained this in terms that a court auditor would accept as methodology. She could have explained it in terms of what she had learned from Sova about the gift's peripheral. Expressions, the fragments that arrived not through eye contact, but through sustained proximity to. Objects that had been handled with specific intent. Financial records maintained by someone in the process of concealing something had a particular quality of careful over-organization. The specific tidiness of papers that had been handled too many times, turned over and resorted in the anxious way of things that needed to look undisturbed while being constantly reviewed. She had found the first anomaly in the third ledger, a regularization of irregular entries that was itself too regular. The specific fingerprint of someone who had corrected a pattern of inconsistency so thoroughly that they had created a new pattern from the correction. She had found the second in the fifth ledger, which confirmed the first's implication. There was a parallel accounting structure, not hidden in the obvious way of removed pages or burned entries, but hidden in the way of a shadow present in the negative space between what the records showed and what they should have shown if the numbers they contained were the complete picture. She had 8 years of healer's apprentice bookkeeping and 20 years of reading, what was actually present rather than what was presented. The shadow accounting was visible to her the way a fate thread was visible, not labeled, not announced. Simply there for anyone who looked at what was actually in the record, rather than at the record's performed appearance of completeness. The archivist had been at his desk when she arrived. He had looked up when she entered, assessed her escort documents with the professional thoroughness of someone whose job was the careful management of access to old information, and had returned to his own work. She had noted his position, his age, his manner efficient, contained. The manner of a person who had occupied the same institutional role for a long time and had developed the particular invisibility of the entirely competent. She had not looked at him directly. She had taken her ledgers to the far table and begun working. 40 minutes later, she looked up from the confirmation of the parallel accounting structure's entry point, a specific date, 32 months ago. 1 month before the first payment in Varen's fate thread, which gave her the origin point of the network's financial infrastructure, and found the archivist's chair empty. He had been there when she arrived. She had tracked his presence through peripheral awareness without processing it consciously, in the way she tracked all occupied spaces. And he had been present, and then he was not present, and she could not identify the moment the transition had occurred. She looked at the chair. She looked at the door on the archive's far end, the service exit that connected to the palace's utility corridor, and found it slightly ajar, which it had not been when she entered. The door behind her opened. She did not startle. She had tracked the footsteps in the outer corridor for the previous 30 seconds and recognized the specific cadence. Aldrich entered, assessed the room in a single sweep, and found her at the far table surrounded by open ledgers. He said, "The night guard said you came directly here." She said, "Yes." She said, "I found the parallel accounting structure. The origin point is 32 months ago, which predates the first transaction in Varen's thread by approximately 1 month, which means the financial infrastructure was built before the operational planning began. This was not improvised. It was constructed deliberately and in advance." He came to the table and looked at what she had marked in the ledgers. He asked questions and she answered them. And the work between them had the easy quality of two people whose different tools were solving the same problem. And she found herself noting this as she would note any accurate observation about a situation without attachment to what it meant about anything beyond itself, which was a discipline she was finding slightly more difficult to maintain than usual. He asked how she knew about financial record structures. She told him about Marin's practice, the 8 years of accounts, the specific education that poverty and responsibility produced in a person who had to manage both simultaneously. He asked what she had done before Marin. She told him about Sova. She told him about the 6 years of learning to manage something she had not asked to have. She told him the outline of it, not the harvest celebration, not Dale. Not the specific texture of the loneliness, just the shape of it, the practical shape. The information required to understand her current capacity and its limits. He listened in the way she was becoming familiar with, without the evaluative overlay of someone cataloging utility. With the attention of someone trying to understand something, because understanding it mattered to him. Then they both looked up from the ledgers and found the archivist's chair. She said, "He was here when I arrived." He looked at the service exit door, ajar in the lamplight. On the chair, a piece of paper, folded once, placed with the deliberate precision of something left rather than forgotten. The paper was unfolded by one of the palace guards who had followed Aldrich to the archive standard protocol for unknown documents in sensitive spaces. The guard handling it with the practiced care of someone trained to treat unfamiliar objects as potential threats before treating them as anything else. It was neither a threat nor a mystery. It was a message, written in a plain administrative hand that contained no identifying features and had clearly been composed with that absence of features as its primary goal. The message described Lyra. Not in general terms. In the specific, detailed terms of someone who had been watching her since the ceremony, her height, her coloring, the borrowed dress she had worn, the precise angle of her downward gaze as she had crossed the hall's floor, the moment her eyes had come up, the specific color of the silver. It described her current room assignment, which was information not in general circulation. It described her working hours over the past 3 days, which required sustained surveillance of palace interior spaces. And then at the bottom, in the same plain administrative hand, one sentence: "The oracle's usefulness has a natural limit." She read the note over the guard's shoulder and processed it with the specific internal stillness she had been practicing for 20 years, which was adequate to the task of maintaining a composed exterior while the information arranged itself in her mind into its accurate shape. This was not a threat directed at Aldrich, at the investigation, at the network's remaining operatives. This was a threat directed at her specifically, from someone who understood what she was and had made the assessment that removing her was the most efficient way to address the investigation's current trajectory. She said to Aldrich, in the same practical tone she used for reporting reading results, "The network has someone inside the palace with access to residential assignment records and sufficient operational patience to conduct 3 days of interior surveillance undetected." She said, "This is a more sophisticated infrastructure than a single security chief's corruption would produce." The foreign principle I referenced in the ceremony reading is the structural center of this. Varen was a node, not the source. Aldrich had read the note. His face was doing the controlled weight expression she had catalogued from the morning he had first reviewed her 12-page report, not shock, but the specific gravity of someone receiving information that confirms an assessment they had hoped was wrong. He gave instructions to his security detail: new room assignment, tripled guard, immediate review of residential records access logs, recovery of the archivist's whereabouts as the first priority. He gave these instructions with the efficient, decisive quality she had observed in him when the situation required it, the version of him that did not pause between recognizing a threat and addressing it. When the guards had moved to their tasks, he said to her, "Come with me." She said, "Where?" He said, "Somewhere with more walls between you and the service exits." He said it in the practical tone of someone solving an immediate logistical problem, which it was. And she went with him because the practical problem was real, and the note's assessment of her situation was accurate, and she had not survived 20 years of careful management by being sentimental about the difference between safety and exposure. The room he took her to was in the palace's interior, no external walls, 2 guards on the corridor. The specific design of a space that had been considered with security rather than comfort as its primary criterion. It was smaller than the guest chamber, but not uncomfortable. She sat in the chair near the lamp. He sat in the chair across from her. And the arrangement was the same arrangement as the medical wing 3 days ago, except that this time she had chosen to be present rather than woken into it. He said, "The archivist." She said, "The fragment I received in the East Corridor this afternoon was the archivist's name. Not a fate thread, just the name. The gift does not produce full readings from fragments, only significant identifications." She said, "I should have told you this afternoon." She said, "I was planning to go to the archive first and confirm the financial records before bringing you the archivist's name so that the information arrived together." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because I have found that accurate information received without supporting evidence is consistently dismissed. And I have 20 years of practice at ensuring that what I present is structured to be undismissible." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is a very efficient adaptation to a specific and sustained failure of the people around you to believe what you told them." She said, "Yes." He said, "I believe what you tell me." She looked at her hands. She said, "I know." She said it the way she said things that were true and that she had not entirely decided what to do with yet. They sat in the room together with the note's information between them and the palace's new security arrangements moving through the corridors around them. And after a while the immediate operational urgency had been addressed, and what remained was the room and the two lamps and the specific quality of late-night quiet in a space where neither of them was performing anything. He said, "I would like to stay here until the new arrangements are confirmed. Not as a guard, just here." She said, "That is not necessary." He said, "I know." He stayed. She did not ask him to leave. She looked at him once briefly, carefully, a fragment of his fate thread arriving before she managed the angle away, and what she saw in the fragment was not dangerous. It was the shape of a future she had never seen directed at herself. Quiet and specific and oriented toward her presence rather than her utility. And she looked away before it resolved into words because she had not yet decided whether she was ready for those particular words. Outside, in the north wing, 3 palace guards stationed at their posts did not appear for their shift change. The 3 missing guards were found by morning. Found was perhaps an imprecise word. They had not been lost in the sense of misplaced or harmed. They had been paid. Each one had received a specific sum in untraceable currency, delivered through a mechanism that the palace's financial investigators were already mapping against the parallel accounting structure Lyra had identified in the archive. The sums were not large. The network had not needed large sums because it had not needed the guards to do anything dangerous, only to be absent from their posts during a specific window, no questions asked, with the understanding that the absence would not be investigated with particular urgency. The network had been wrong about the urgency of the investigation. The guards had cooperated fully once it became clear that cooperation was their best available outcome. Their testimonies confirmed 3 things. The archivist had been the network's interior coordinator for at least 4 years longer than Varen's operational involvement, which made him not a subsidiary participant, but a foundational one. The surveillance of Lyra had been ongoing since the ceremony, which meant the network had responded to the ceremony's exposure within hours rather than days. And the network's interior communication structure used a relay system through the palace's supply chain rather than direct messenger, a method that was slow and difficult to interrupt because it was entirely invisible against the background noise of routine palace logistics. Aldrich reviewed this information with Lyra present. In the interior room that had become their working space by practical necessity and a process of gradual mutual decision neither of them had formally announced. The security detail had been reconfigured. The archivist's whereabouts remained unknown. He had left the palace through the service entrance the previous night and had not been identified at any of the city's monitored exits, which told her something about the sophistication of the exit infrastructure the network had maintained. The archivist's full records recovered before his departure by a palace administrator who had been given access codes and Aldrich's name confirmed the financial map Lyra had partially reconstructed from the ledgers. The parallel accounting structure connected directly to 4 members of the Royal Council, not peripheral participants. Senior council members with vote weights that shaped the kingdom's policy decisions on a regular basis. She read the names and recognized 2 of them from the ceremony background figures, not the ones she had read. The ones who had been standing at sufficient distance from the urgency of Varen's immediate threat that the gift had not flagged them as requiring attention in that context. She had read urgency, not entirety. The gift had shown her the network's most immediately dangerous nodes and had not had time, before the cost overtook her, to provide a complete map. She said this to Aldrich plainly, the way she said all accurate things. She had seen what was urgent. She had not seen everything. He said, "How do we see the rest?" She said, "There are 2 options. The first is continued covert investigation through conventional means following the financial records, intercepting the supply chain relay, building a case through evidence that does not depend on her readings." She said, "This will take months, and the network will continue operating during those months, and has already demonstrated it is capable of adapting to the investigation's progress." He said, "The second option." She said, "The ancient Oracle protocol." She had encountered the reference in Sova's records, the formal legal framework predating the current monarchy by several generations, under which an oracle's audience was convened as an official proceeding. The oracle's readings entered directly into court record as admissible testimony, and the oracle herself protected by legal provisions that made any interference with her person during a formally invoked session an act against the court itself. She said, under the protocol, her readings are not evidence supporting an investigation. They are the proceeding itself. The 4 council members would be called before her publicly, in the formal audience chamber, under the old law's protections. What she saw would be the court's record. She said, this would require him to formally recognize her gift as legitimate, give her standing to speak in court without his authorization, and publicly sponsor a proceeding in which she would not be under his direction. He said, tell me what it costs you. She told him the truth the last formal oracle's audience in the historical record had produced: full incapacitation for 3 days and documented permanent degradation of the peripheral vision of the oracle who conducted it. She said, 4 readings in sequence at the intensity a formal proceeding required was more than she had ever done. She said, she did not know the precise cost because she had never done it. He said, I will not ask you to do that. She said, you are not asking me. I am deciding. The silence that followed was not the silence of 2 people disagreeing. It was the silence of 2 people at the edge of a significant decision, both aware of the weight, neither pushing. Then from the direction of the east wing came a sound she felt before she heard, a low concussive force, muffled by distance and stone, that the palace absorbed and transmitted through its floor before the sound wave reached them. She looked at him. He was already looking at her. He said, that was the archive. The archive's eastern section was gone. Not destroyed in the sense of fire or structural collapse, the palace's construction was too substantial for that, but the record storage rooms that had housed the financial ledgers, the parallel accounting documentation, and the archivist's decades of coordinating records had been thoroughly emptied by an accelerant that had consumed paper and parchment with specific efficiency while leaving the stone walls largely intact. The palace's fire response had contained the damage within the hour. What the damage contained was the complete physical record of the parallel accounting structure Lyra had reconstructed from memory and confirmed through the archivist's recovered files. The recovered files had been copied. Aldrich had ordered copies made the morning after the archive visit, when the archivist's absence first became known. The copies were in the palace's second vault, behind locks that the network had not had time to address. The financial evidence survived. The archive did not. She stood in the corridor outside the damaged section's entrance with a palace security officer's report in her hands. Reading it in the specific way she read all information, attending to what it said, and simultaneously to what its saying implied about the speaker's awareness of their own gaps. The report was thorough. It confirmed the accelerant type, the time of ignition, the absence of any palace personnel in the section at the time, the recovery of a single relay note consistent with the supply chain communication system near the section's service entrance. The report did not address the question of who had known about the copied files and whether the archive's destruction had been intended to eliminate the originals before the copy's existence was known, or whether the destruction was a signal rather than a practical measure. She thought it was a signal. She said this to Aldrich when he arrived from the security briefing. Standing in the same corridor outside the damaged section, the smell of burned record-keeping drifting through the stone in a specific way that she found she had feelings about she was not going to examine at present. She said, they know about the copies. They are not trying to eliminate the evidence. They are demonstrating that they can reach inside this palace and act without consequence, and they are doing it now specifically because they know the formal proceeding is under consideration. She said, this is aimed at making the proceeding seem insufficiently protected. He said, is it insufficiently protected? She said, no. The ancient oracle protocol's protections are explicit and carry the weight of 200 years of legal precedent. They cannot interfere with a formally invoked session without committing an act against the court's foundational law. She said, "What they can do is make me afraid before the session happens, which is what this is for." He looked at her. She looked back at him, not fully, not the sustained contact that activated the gift, but the direct peripheral engagement she had been allowing herself for several days in contexts where the gift did not assess the other person's fate thread as urgent. She had been examining the question of why she had started allowing this, and had not yet finished examining it. He said, "Are you afraid?" She said, "Yes." She said it the way she said accurate things without apology or performance. She said, "I have been afraid every time I have used the gift in a consequential way for 20 years. I used it anyway every time." She said, "The fear is not the deciding factor." They stood in the corridor for a moment with the burned archive behind them and the copied records. In the second vault, and the 4 council members currently going about their morning as though they were not 4 days from a formal oracle's audience that would end their political careers and their freedom simultaneously. He said, "I have been thinking about what you told me your fate thread showed. The branch point." He said, "You said the branch I needed to take required me to believe, in the moment it mattered, that you knew what you were doing." She said, "Yes." He said, "I want you to know that I already believe that. I want you to know it is not a new belief produced by the investigation's results or the ceremony's events." He said, "I looked at what you have been doing since you woke in the medical wing, and I saw what was there, which is someone who knows exactly what she is doing, and has always known, and has been doing it without anyone providing her the conditions to do it fully." He said, "I should have been the person who provided those conditions a long time ago." He said, "I know that I cannot correct the timeline of that. I can only correct the present." She looked at her hands. She said, "The formal audience is tomorrow. I would like to use tonight to prepare." He said, "I will leave you to it." He reached the room's door and turned back. She said, "Aldrich." He went still at the use of his name without his title, which was the first time she had done it. She said, "Your fate thread has a branch point at dawn tomorrow. The branch that matters requires you to leave the throne." He said, "Leave it how?" She said, "You will know when the moment comes." She paused. "The branch I need you to take requires you to be willing to step off the platform before you know exactly where you will land." He said, "I already believe that you know where I will land." She said, "Good." She said, "Now go. I need to sleep." The audience chamber was the largest formal space in the palace. Not the mating hall. The audience chamber was older, higher ceilinged, built in the architectural grammar of an era that had understood civic ceremony as something that should feel genuinely significant rather than merely grand. The stone was darker, the windows narrower and set higher, the light that came through them having traveled far enough that it arrived diffused and directionless. It was a room that flattened hierarchy in a specific way. Everyone in it was equally small against the scale of the thing, which Lyra had determined, upon entering, was probably why the old law had specified this room for formal oracle proceedings. The full court was assembled along the walls in the order of rank, which meant the 4 council members she was here for were visible from the room's center at specific points along the left wall. She had studied the seating chart the previous evening, had placed each name to a position, had rehearsed the angles required to conduct each reading with managed eye contact duration, rather than full uncontrolled activation. She had a plan. The plan was the product of a careful night's preparation and the 20 years of practice that preceded it. And she was aware that plans made for the gift had a limited relationship with the gift's actual operations under conditions of genuine urgency. She stood in the chamber's center without a raised platform, without a throne, without any court position marker. She wore her own clothing. She had decided this deliberately, not the borrowed dress of the mating ceremony, not anything supplied by the palace. but the plain practical linen she had worn for 8 years in Marin's practice, which was clean and well-maintained and communicated exactly what she was rather than what any court wished to present her as. Her eyes were down, not from the old reflex of fear and management, from the specific deliberateness of someone who had chosen the angle for today and would choose when to end it. The court recorder read the ancient oracle protocol in full. The language was archaic in the specific way of legal texts that have not needed updating because they were written to last precise, unornamented, each provision following from the previous with the logical inevitability of something constructed rather than accumulated. The protocol established her person as untouchable during the formal session. It established her readings as court testimony of the highest evidentiary category. It established that refusal of a formal oracle reading constituted an admission of guilt under the court's own foundational law. It established that King Aldrich of Kerith was the formal sponsor of this proceeding, which meant he had staked his own legal standing on its conduct and outcome. He was on the throne at the chamber's far end. He was sitting in the correct ceremonial posture of a formal proceeding's royal sponsor, which required stillness and presence and a specific quality of witnessed authority. She had told him there was a branch point at dawn. She had not told him what the branch looked like from the inside. She had told him he would know it when it came. She asked the first council member to approach. His name was Lord Eshin, Financial Oversight Council, third most senior member, the one whose role in the parallel accounting structure had been the most technically sophisticated and the least immediately visible. He was perhaps 55, silver-haired, with the manner of someone who had been managing the presentation of complex information for long enough that the management had become entirely automatic. He approached with a composed expression and a deliberate steadiness that communicated he had prepared for this, which was accurate. She looked up at him. The silver came. The reading was controlled. She managed the contact duration with the same precision she had used in the interrogation sessions. 3 days of practice making the technique more reliable than it had been at the start. Eshin's fate thread was financial and intricate, and the gift moved through it with the specific efficiency of a tool applied to work it was designed for. And she spoke what it showed her in the same steady resonant voice she had used at the ceremony. And the court recorder's pen moved without stopping. Lord Eshin went pale before the reading's second minute. He did not deny. Under the protocol's conditions, denial was not a productive strategy. The gift continued regardless. And the specific detail of what it produced was of the quality that denial only underscored. He stood in the chamber's center and was read and did not speak, which was its own kind of answer. 2 more readings followed the same pattern. The chamber grew quieter with each one, not the silence of shock, but the silence of a court that was revising something fundamental about its understanding of what evidence meant and what truth looked like when it was not managed through the conventional channels of political presentation. Lord Kale was called. He was the most senior of the 4. He was 68 years old, politically connected through 40 years of careful alliance building. The kind of figure whose influence operated through relationships rather than direct action, and who had constructed his position with such thoroughness that touching him had always seemed like touching the foundations of the court itself. He looked at the floor. She said, "Lord Kale, the protocol requires you to approach and meet my eyes." He said, without looking up, he declined the reading on grounds of health. His voice was steady. He had prepared this response. The court recorder said, under the formal oracle protocol, refusal of a formally invoked reading constitutes an admission of guilt as entered into permanent court record. Shall I record the refusal? Lord Kale said nothing. From the back of the chamber, from the position Lyra had identified from the seating chart as belonging to Lord Kale's primary factional ally, a man named Dreist who had been present at the ceremony and whose fate thread she had not read because he had not been within the urgency radius, came a sound. Not a spoken sound, the specific sound of something being drawn. She did not move. This was not courage, or not primarily courage, it was the specific trained stillness of someone whose survival had depended for 20 years on not producing reactive movement in situations where reactive movement would make things worse. She stood in the chamber's center and processed what she had heard with the rapid accuracy of someone who had spent 2 decades reading situations from incomplete information. And she determined in approximately 2 seconds that the drawn weapon was positioned at the left rear of the chamber, that the palace guard nearest to it was 12 feet away and turning toward the sound, and that the distance between her current position and any available cover was greater than the distance between the weapon and herself. She also determined in the same 2 seconds that she had seen this. Not in the specific detail of the exact moment. Fate threads did not produce that kind of frame-by-frame preview, but in the shape of it. The branch point she had told Aldrich about. The dawn action she had described as stepping off the platform before knowing where he would land. She had seen the shape of the moment, and she had told him what it required. And she was now standing in the moment and waiting to see whether the shape she had seen in his fate thread was accurate. The throne was at the chamber's far end. It was 30 feet from her position. She heard him move before she saw him, the specific sound of a person descending a formal platform with speed rather than ceremony. The quiet but unmistakable shift of authority from its designated position to the chamber's floor. Not a guard responding to a protocol. The king himself on the chamber's floor, moving in the direction that placed him between the left rear of the room and the chamber's center. Between Dreist and her. It was not a dramatic act in the physical sense. He was not running, not performing heroism for the watching court. He was simply walking, with the decisive purposefulness of someone who had made a calculation and was acting on it before the calculation could be reconsidered. And the court watched him cross the chamber floor in silence, because what was happening was the specific kind of thing that courtiers understood without being told. The king had left the throne, voluntarily, and placed his body as a human declaration that the person standing in the chamber's center was not a tool of the proceeding, but its reason. The palace guard disarmed Dreist 20 seconds after the sound of drawing. He did not resist. The weapon was confiscated. Lord Kale was placed under immediate guard without further ceremony. His refusal entered into the court record as the protocol required. Aldrich stood in the chamber's floor between Lyra and the now contained threat. And he did not look at her. He was conducting the rapid assessment of the chamber's security that the situation required, and she looked at him for 3 seconds from the periphery of her managed gaze, and saw the quality she had read in his fate thread, and had been watching him practice in the interior room and the archive and the medical wing. The version of him that looked at what was actually present rather than at what was convenient to believe was present. The version that had chosen to step off the platform. Lord Kale still had not met her eyes. She crossed the chamber floor to where he stood under guard, and she said to him, quietly and precisely, the way she said all accurate things. The protocol allows for the reading of objects in cases of subject non-cooperation. She said, I would like his personal seal. She had not told Aldrich about this provision. She had told him she believed it existed because she had read the protocol 3 times the previous evening and had found the provision in the 3rd reading. In language archaic enough that she had consulted Sova's old notes to confirm the translation. She had not mentioned it in their negotiations because she had wanted to understand the situation fully before introducing it, and because she had not yet been certain she would need it. She needed it. The seal was removed from Lord Kale's hand by the guard and placed in her palm. She closed her fingers around it and looked at nothing specific and let the gift find the object's history. Reading from an object was different from reading from a person. Slower, less precise. The images arriving in a different sequence, not urgency sorted but chronological. The history of the object's primary user laid out in the order it had accumulated rather than the order it mattered. She let it run. She managed her breathing with the specific discipline of someone who had been told by every historical account, she had found that object reading at this depth was the most costly technique available, and had decided to do it anyway because Lord Kale's political connections meant the refusal alone was not enough. The reading took 6 minutes. The court was absolutely silent for all 6. She spoke what the seal showed her in the steady, resonant voice, and the court recorder's pen moved without stopping, and Lord Kale did not speak. And what she produced in those 6 minutes was the complete administrative and financial map of the network's internal structure, the specific communication protocols, the foreign principals' name delivered in full. The 11 years of relationship that predated Varen's involvement by 8 years, and explained why Varen's removal had not collapsed the network, because Varen had not been the source. Lord Kale had been the source. She stopped when the object's history reached the present, and there was nothing more to read. The seal was cold in her palm. She was cold in every extremity. The gift having extracted the sustained object reading's full cost without pause or negotiation. She was aware of her knees with the specific awareness of someone monitoring structural components under stress. She completed 2 more sentences, the foreign principals' documented connection to 3 specific policy decisions that had shaped the kingdom's eastern alliances over 11 years, and then her knees gave. She did not hit the floor. His hands were already there. The first time he had touched her, in the mating hall, she had been unconscious. This time she was present for it, his arm around her. The specific warmth and solidity of a person who had moved with certainty before she finished falling. And she was too depleted to produce any response except the honest one, which was to let herself be held by someone who had stepped off a throne to stand beside her, and had done it in front of every significant person in the kingdom. The court's silence had a different quality now than it had ever had before. She was carried from the chamber. The last thing she saw before the aftermath took her was the court, the assembled faces, the recorders, the guards, the remaining council members. All of the people who had watched her read and been read and speak and be taken seriously, and then be caught rather than left to fall, and their faces had a quality she did not have a precise word for. Something between witnessing and understanding. Something that looked like the beginning of a different kind of court. She slept for 2 days. Not unconscious in the way of the ceremony's aftermath, not the absolute lights-out collapse of a full involuntary reading, where the body simply stopped and the mind had no say in the matter. This was deeper and more deliberate. The sleep of a body that had done something it had never done before, and was conducting a thorough internal accounting of what it had spent and what remained. She surfaced occasionally, aware of the medical wing's ceiling, aware of Sarah's presence. Aware of the lamp that someone kept burning at a low, consistent level that did not require her damaged vision to work hard to process, and then went back under without deciding to, which she found she did not object to. Her body had earned the right to make its own schedule for a few days. On the first evening, she heard voices in the corridor outside the medical wing. Not close enough to produce fragments, distance was a reliable buffer against the gift's peripheral expressions, which was something she had used strategically for 20 years and would presumably continue using. Just voices, the specific cadence of palace staff going about palace business, and beneath it a quieter quality that she identified from long practice at reading the emotional texture of occupied spaces as the particular quality of a building that was processing something significant that had happened inside it. On the second morning, the palace healer Sarah sat at her bedside and gave her a full report of her physical condition. The peripheral vision degradation was present and measurable, less severe than the historical account had described for the precedent oracle, which Sarah attributed to the quality of the object reading technique versus direct person reading, and then, in the tone of someone who had been waiting for the right moment, told her what had happened in the court since the audience concluded. The 4 council members were in custody. Lord Kale's testimony, compelled by the formal record of the oracle reading and the protocol's legal weight, had confirmed the foreign principal's involvement with the specific detail required for diplomatic proceedings. The foreign principal had been named in an official kingdom communication sent within 12 hours of the session's conclusion. The archivist had been identified and apprehended at a border crossing 2 days after his departure. And King Aldrich had addressed the court. Sarah had not been present. She described what she had been told by 3 separate palace staff members, who had each approached her independently to relay the content of the address, which she noted was the specific behavior of people who wanted to ensure that someone in particular received a piece of information. She said, "I believe they wanted you to know what he said." He had said 3 things. The first was the full legal and security accounting of the network's exposure, the foreign connection, the financial structure, the 11 years of embedded manipulation, the specific provisions of the Oracle protocol under which the evidence had been gathered, and the legal standing it carried. This portion of the address was formal and thorough, and covered the ground required to establish the kingdom's security framework going forward. The second was the formal legal record of the Oracle's audience findings, entered into permanent court record as the protocol required, with each council member's specific offenses documented in the language Lyra's readings had produced. The third was not required by any protocol. He had said that the kingdom's mating ceremony had, for the duration of its current form, selected for performance rather than substance in its candidate assessment process. He had said that this selection optimized the court for the presentation of qualities rather than the possession of them, and that a court optimized for presentation rather than accuracy could not see threats that wore the appropriate clothes. He had said that the individual he had most thoroughly dismissed at the ceremony had been the individual who saved his life in the same breath as her dismissal, and that this was not a coincidence but a direct consequence of the failure of his own attention, applied at speed rather than depth, to reach an accurate assessment of what was actually in front of him. He had said this on the record, in the specific language of a formal court address, in front of every person whose opinion shaped the court's culture. Sarah quoted it from a copy of the address transcript that 3 separate staff members had independently ensured she received. Lyra lay in the medical wing bed and looked at the high stone ceiling and processed this with the specific attention she brought to all accurate information, attending to what it said and simultaneously to what its saying implied. He had not softened it. He had not framed his behavior at the ceremony as an understandable response to available information. He had named it as a failure of his own attention, in public, on the record, in the language of formal court address. She thought about the fragment she had caught in the interior room, the shape of a future directed at her presence rather than her utility, the words she had not let resolve. She thought about the branch point and the platform and the 30 feet of chamber floor he had crossed without running, without hesitation, with the decisive purposefulness of someone who had made a calculation and did not intend to reconsider it. She thought about what it meant that she was lying in this bed with the aftermath of the most extensive thing she had ever done with her gift, and someone had kept a lamp burning at a consistent low level for 2 days, so her damaged vision did not have to work harder than necessary. There was a knock at the medical wing door. Sarah opened it. He was outside. She told Sarah she would sit up for this. Sarah adjusted the pillows with the efficient thoroughness she applied to everything and withdrew to the medical wing's outer room, which was the palace healer's version of privacy, present and available, technically not listening, entirely aware of everything said through the stone wall's modest acoustic properties. Lyra had spent 8 years in a healer's practice. She understood the category. Aldrich entered and sat in the chair across from her, which was where he always sat, which she had stopped finding remarkable approximately 4 days ago, and had begun finding instead a specific quality of reliable that she was still examining the implications of. He looked, she noted from her peripheral management, like someone who had slept marginally better than the previous 2 days, but had still not slept as much as was physiologically advisable. His court composure was present, but it was the version of his court composure she had learned to differentiate from the performed version, not a management of impression, but simply the discipline of someone who had a great deal to do and was doing it. He said, "How is your vision?" She said, "Degraded at the periphery." Sarah says the degradation is measurable, but less than the historical precedent suggested. She said, "It will likely stabilize at a partial reduction rather than a complete loss." She said, "I am adjusting to it." He said, "I am sorry." She said, "I know." She said, "I chose it." The responsibility for a choice belongs to the person who made it. He accepted this without attempting to redistribute the responsibility, which she appreciated. She said, "I have been thinking about what I need before I formalize any role in this kingdom." He said, "Tell me." She had spent 2 days on the medical wing ceiling preparing for this conversation with the specific thoroughness she brought to all consequential preparations. She had thought about what she actually needed, as opposed to what would be reasonable to ask for, as opposed to what was likely to be accepted. And she had decided to begin with what she actually needed and let the negotiation, if there was to be a negotiation, proceed from accuracy rather than strategy. She said 3 things. He said nothing. He waited, which she had come to recognize as one of his more significant competencies, the ability to wait for someone to finish rather than anticipating their conclusion and responding to the anticipated version. She said, "First, the Oracle protocol must be codified into standing law as a permanent provision available to any citizen rather than something invoked on a case-by-case basis through royal sponsorship. Specifically, the protocol must be available to citizens investigating official misconduct, without requiring the sponsorship of the official authority being investigated." She said, "The version we used required your sponsorship. If the conduct being investigated is yours, the current form does not work." She said, "The law must not have this gap." He said, "Agreed." She said, "Second, the mating ceremony's candidate assessment process must be changed." She said, not abolished. She understood the ceremony's practical function in the kingdom's social structure and was not proposing to eliminate a mechanism that served genuine purposes. She said, "The assessment must include documented capability reviews, conducted by a panel that includes Omega Council members, with stipends substantial enough that attendance is not a financial hardship and non-attendance is not a financial sacrifice." She said, "The kingdom nearly missed something important because a neighbor submitted her name for 12 silver crowns. The kingdom cannot afford to have its security depend on the adequate funding of its candidates' neighbors." He said, "Agreed." She said, "Third, her role, if she had one, was formally independent of royal authority. She answered to the kingdom's citizens through the Oracle protocol, not to the king through personal relationship. The Oracle's standing was not contingent on the standing of any individual on any throne." She said, "I am telling you this not as a protection against you specifically. I am telling you this because accurate truth-telling that depends on the goodwill of a powerful person is not reliable truth-telling. The reliability is the point. If the reliability depends on our relationship remaining positive, it is not reliable in the situations where it matters most, which are the situations where our relationship is under the most stress." He was quiet for a long moment. She watched him from her periphery and saw him work through this with the attention he brought to things that were genuinely complex, not the speed of conclusion that his fate thread had named as his primary liability, but the slower, more accurate process she had watched him practice in the interior room and the archive. He said, "Agreed." He said, "All 3. He said, "I want to add one thing." She said, "I am listening." He said, "I want to court you through proper channels, separately from and without dependency on any of the 3 provisions you have just named." He said, "The courtship is not a condition of any of those provisions and will not affect them in either direction, regardless of its outcome." She looked at him for a long moment, not the peripheral management. Not the bridge-of-the-nose technique, but directly, with the full honest attention of someone who had spent 20 years not doing this and was choosing to now. She said, "You do not frighten me anymore." He said, "Good." She said, "Which means I will actually see you when you court me. I see accurately. I want you to know that before you decide." He said, "I know that." He said, "I am counting on it." The Oracle's hall was not grand. This was a deliberate decision, and Lyra had made it before the space was assigned. Had made it in the specific way she made decisions that mattered by thinking through what the space was for and working backward from function to form, rather than forward from available resources to the most impressive available deployment of them. The hall was for people who needed accurate information and did not have reliable access to it through conventional channels. Grand spaces communicated before anyone in them said a word. That access was conditional on having the right credentials to occupy them. She did not want that communication. She wanted the door to open without qualification. The space was in the palace's public wing, the section of the palace that connected to the city's administrative center, where citizens came for licensing, records, and the routine interface with institutional authority that civic life required. It was not a prestigious location in the court's internal geography. It was, however, a location that anyone could reach without entering the palace's formal sections, without passing through guard checkpoints that carried implicit class screening, without feeling that their presence required justification. The door was plain. The sign above it was plain. The interior was warm and adequately lit and contained enough chairs for 12 people to wait without standing, and a front room for initial intake, and a reading room behind it where the formal sessions happened, and a recovery room behind that where she could rest between readings without being visible to the people waiting in the front room. The recovery room had been her one request to the design team, not the largest room, not the most comfortable furniture, but a room specifically for that purpose. Because she had spent 20 years recovering from the gift's aftermath in whatever space happened to be available, which was usually inadequate. And she had decided that if she was going to do this work properly, she was going to do it in conditions that did not require her to manage her recovery around other people's schedules. In the Oracle's hall's first 2 weeks, 17 people came. The first was an elderly woman from the city's western district, whose grandson had been accused of embezzling from his employer. She did not want a full reading. She wanted to know whether she should believe him when he said he had not done it. Lyra sat across from her and explained the gift's limitations with the same plain precision she used to explain everything. She could not read absent people's fate threads directly, but she could read the woman's own fate thread for the relevant period, which would show the quality of her grandson's relationship with her and the emotional texture of what she knew versus what she feared. The woman agreed. The reading took 90 seconds. It did not exonerate the grandson. The gift did not produce that kind of binary verdict, but it showed the woman clearly that what she knew from 23 years of relationship was more reliable than what she feared from 3 days of accusation. She left with her own knowledge confirmed rather than replaced. The second was a young Omega from the mating ceremony pool, one of the candidates from the same ceremony, lower ranked, who had heard what happened and had traveled to the city specifically to ask whether she might be formally reassessed under the new candidate evaluation protocols. Lyra told her about the protocols, the capability documentation, the mixed panel, the adequate stipend, and assisted her with the application. She did not read her fate. The woman had not asked for that and did not need it. She needed to know the process existed. The third was an administrative official from the palace's financial oversight division who wanted the Oracle's formal assessment of a discrepancy in departmental records he had identified but did not have sufficient standing to escalate through conventional channels without risk of professional consequence. Lyra had handled this one herself in the reading room. With the official's primary account book and 20 minutes of object reading, that produced a clear and documentable picture of the discrepancy's source. The official left with a formal oracle's record of the reading that carried the same legal weight as court testimony and could be submitted to the appropriate oversight body without requiring him to be the sole human shield for the information's delivery. This was the use she had designed the oracle protocol provision for. Not the dramatic court proceedings of a conspiracy's exposure, those were the exception. The circumstance where the gift had been required to operate at its maximum and had paid the maximum cost. The daily work was this: people with accurate information they could not safely carry alone. Coming to a place where the information could be verified and formally recorded and given the legal standing that made it actionable. She was good at this work in the specific way she was good at all work that required sustained attention and the willingness to receive difficult information without flinching from it. Aldrich appeared on the third day. He was not in court clothes. She had noticed, over the previous weeks, that he had developed what appeared to be a working definition of which contexts required formal court presentation and which did not, and the oracle's hall had been assessed as the latter. He wore the plain version of himself she had first seen in the medical wing chair after 9 hours of waiting, and he crossed the front room in the specific way of a person who had decided where they were going and was going there without announcing it. He spoke to the intake staff member with the same manner he used with everyone in the hall, not deferentially, not with the performed egalitarianism of a high-ranked person trying to communicate their lack of condescension, but simply directly, one person to another, which was a different thing, and she had watched it develop in him over the weeks since the audience and found it accurate. He said he wanted to be registered as a formal hall petitioner. The intake staff member, a young woman named Kala, who had been hired 3 days after the hall opened and had a specific gift for administrative thoroughness, said she would need his documentation of purpose. He provided it. Regular consultation on court matters, submitted through official protocol channels, subject to the oracle's availability and discretion. Lyra had been in the reading room, visible through the open connecting door. She said, "You know you do not need to do it this way." He said, "I know." He registered. He sat in the waiting room with the 11 other people currently waiting, in the chair nearest the window, and waited his turn. When Kala called his name, she called it without any distinguishing ceremony, the same way she called every name, which Lyra had specifically requested. He came into the reading room and sat across from her at the reading table. She said, "You registered as a regular petitioner for court consultation." He said, "Yes." She said, "You have direct access to my time outside official channels through the informal arrangement we have developed over the past month." He said, "Yes." He said, "But this is not that. When I come here as a petitioner, I am subject to the same protocol as every other petitioner, which means the oracle's assessment of what I tell her has the same legal and evidentiary weight as her assessment of anything else she formally receives." He said, "I want the things I bring here to carry that weight." He said, "I want my own conduct as king to be accountable to the same oracle protocol I sponsored for everyone else." He said, "Otherwise the protocol has an exception built into it for the most powerful person it is designed to govern, which makes it not a protocol at all." She looked at him for a long moment. She picked up the reading table's formal registration document, which Kala had prepared with the efficient thoroughness that characterized everything she did, and signed her acceptance of the petition. She said, "I am going to read you now, voluntarily, formally, for the official record. This is the first full voluntary reading I have conducted of you. I want you to understand what a full voluntary reading produces. It is not limited to urgency. It is the complete picture. And the complete picture of any person contains things they might prefer not to be read in a formal proceeding." He said, "I know." She said, "You are not concerned." He said, "I have spent 6 weeks being the person who shows up and does the unglamorous work and stays in chairs and steps off platforms. and I would like the oracle's formal record to reflect whatever the gift shows her about that. He said, I am not afraid of being seen accurately. He said, I have been practicing. The silver came. She let it run the full course for the first time, not the fragment, not the managed brief contact. The complete, uninterrupted fate thread of the man sitting across from her in the reading room of the hall she had built in the place she had decided to stay. She read everything. The branch point she had seen in the ceremony hall already taken. The futures that had been available from that branch and the quality of the one he had moved into. The specific texture of his attention in the weeks she had known him, which the fate thread showed as a genuine change rather than a performed one, not the performance of accuracy, but its actual practice, daily and imperfect and consistent. She read things she did not intend to enter into the formal record and did not speak aloud, because they were not urgent and not relevant to governance and belonged to the category of what she had decided were hers to sit with privately until she decided what to do with them. When her eyes returned to their natural pale gray, she sat quietly for a moment with the gift's routine aftermath, and then she said, The formal record shows a king whose primary capacity for clear sight is currently being deployed at a higher rate than at any previous point in his documented reign. She said, The oracle recommends continued deployment. She said, The oracle also notes that the petitioner's commitment to accountability through official channels is reflected in the fate thread and assessed as genuine. He said, That is the most official thing anyone has ever said to me. She said, You registered as an official petitioner. He said, and she said, and the specifics are for later. I have 10 more petitioners waiting. He said, Of course. He rose and moved toward the door, and then he turned back, which was a habit of his she had stopped attempting to anticipate. He said, This evening when the hall closes, would you like to walk in the garden? He said it with the specific combination of directness and genuine uncertainty that constituted his version of courtship, which she had been watching develop over the previous month with the attention she brought to all accurate observations. She said, Yes. He left. She heard him exchange a brief word with Kala about whether he needed to schedule his next official consultation or whether walk-in registration was available for regular petitioners. And Kala told him, with the politely efficient tone she used for everyone, that walk-in registration was available every day the hall was open, which was every day except the rest days she had negotiated as a condition of Lyra's acceptance of the role. Lyra looked at the official registration document, his formal signature below hers, entered into the oracle's permanent record, and felt something she recognized, having seen its shape in fate threads for 20 years, as the specific quality of a thing settling into its correct position. For years changed certain things and did not change others. The things that changed, the mating ceremony's candidate assessment protocol, revised within the year per the oracle's formal recommendation, now included capability documentation for every candidate regardless of rank, reviewed by a panel with mandatory Omega representation, with a stipend substantial enough that the 12 silver crowns Lena had submitted Lyra's name to collect were a quaint historical footnote rather than a reasonable decision made by a reasonable neighbor in the absence of better options. The first ceremony conducted under the new protocols produced 3 candidates whose gifts had previously gone entirely undocumented by any official process. 2 of them were now registered hall petitioners. One of them was Lyra's second practitioner. The Oracle Protocol was codified into permanent standing law in the kingdom's foundational legal record 11 months after the audience. The provision Lyra had specifically required the availability of the protocol to citizens, investigating official misconduct without the need for the official sponsorship had been tested twice in the 4 years since. Both tests had produced findings that the conventional investigative structure would not have reached in the relevant time frame. Both findings had been entered into permanent court record and acted upon. Lord Kale's testimony, compelled by the protocol's legal weight, had provided the specific documentation required for the diplomatic proceedings against the foreign principal. The proceedings had concluded 14 months after the audience with a settlement that significantly restructured the kingdom's eastern alliances in ways the foreign principal had spent 11 years trying to prevent. 3 of the paid guards who had been absent from their posts the night before the archives. Destruction had eventually returned and provided testimony in exchange for reduced penalties. The archivist had been prosecuted on the full record of the oracle's reading and was currently in the kingdom's eastern detention facility. Varen had received the same. The oracle's hall had 2 additional practitioners. Both were Omegas whose fate-reading variants had been identified through the new mating ceremony assessment protocols. The variants were not identical to Lyra's one red emotional fate, rather than event fate, which produced information about the quality of decisions rather than their specific outcomes. The other red relational fate, which showed the future condition of relationships between people rather than the futures of individuals. All 3 variants had applications that did not overlap cleanly, which meant the hall's formal capacity was broader than any individual practitioners. Lyra had spent 2 years building the operational framework for the hall, 1 year training the additional practitioners, and 1 year stepping back from the daily administration to take on the broader conceptual work of establishing what the oracle's role in the kingdom's governance structure actually was, which was a question she had found more interesting and less answerable than she had initially expected. The answer she had settled on, provisionally. The oracle's role was to be the place where accuracy was protected rather than managed. Not the place that produced certainty. She had spent 20 years in uncomfortable proximity to the specific damage certainty did when it was confused with accuracy, but the place that provided a formal mechanism for difficult truths to exist in the record without being revised out of it by the convenience of power. The exile document was in the permanent court record. The address was in the permanent court record. The oracle's reading of the mating ceremony's candidate was in the permanent court record. None of them would be removed because none of the 3 provisions she had negotiated permitted their removal. The record was the record. The truth had been given official protection. She had never moved back to Marin's healing practice. She had visited regularly, bringing the good lamp oil and the specific botanical compounds Marin preferred for the practice's respiratory treatments, and occasionally sitting at the kitchen table in the room she had lived in for 8 years, and telling Marin what was happening in language that Marin received with the sharp-eyed pragmatism of someone who had always known more than she had asked to confirm. Marin had met Aldrich on the 2nd visit and had assessed him with the specific thoroughness of someone who had been watching over a person they loved for 8 years and was not prepared to be anything less than entirely accurate about the quality of whoever was also going to be watching over that person. She had told Lyra afterward, "He looks at you like he is actually looking at you." Lyra had said, "Yes." Marin had said, "About time." The garden that Aldrich had invited her to walk in on the evening of his first official hall consultation had become the location of a great deal of subsequent conversation. The specific, slow-burn accumulation of 2 people who had decided to be genuinely seen by each other and were finding that the experience was both exactly as frightening and exactly as worth it as they had understood it would be. The courtship had proceeded through the official channels he had specified, with the formal patience of someone who had decided to do the thing properly and was not in a hurry to skip steps that existed for good reasons. There was a daughter. She was 2 years old, with Lyra's pale gray eyes and Aldrich's broad frame in miniature, and the specific quality of attention that appeared in both her parents in different expressions in Lyra as the downward focus of someone listening for something below the surface of the available information. In Aldrich as the outward steady gaze of someone who had decided to look at what was actually present rather than what was presented. Her daughter looked at things with both. On a morning in early spring, in the garden that had become their place without being announced as such, The daughter was sitting in the low-cut grass between the old pear tree and the garden's south wall, pressing both palms flat to the earth in the exploratory way of small children who had not yet been told that the world was organized into categories of appropriate and inappropriate fascination. She was looking at the ground with the quality of focused attention Lyra recognized the way she recognized everything she had spent 20 years watching at close range. Then she looked up at Lyra. Her eyes were pale gray. In the morning light, at a specific angle, they shifted. Just for a moment, just for the space of one breath and the next. In the early spring light between the pear tree and the south wall, the pale gray moved toward silver. Then back. The daughter looked at her palms and then at Lyra with the complete, undefended curiosity of someone for whom the world was entirely new and entirely worth examining. Lyra looked back at her. She looked directly, no angle management, no carefully maintained periphery. Just her daughter's face in the morning light, the pale eyes that might carry what hers carried. The wide, unguarded gaze of a person who had not yet learned that looking was dangerous. She would not teach her that. She had already decided. She would teach her everything else: the management, the costs, the specific disciplines of a gift that demanded more than it asked permission to take. She would teach her all of it, in the right order, when the right order arrived. But not that looking was dangerous. She said, "I see you." The daughter looked at her with the silver-adjacent eyes and said nothing, because she was 2 years old and had not yet assembled a sufficient vocabulary for the things she was observing. But the quality of her attention in that moment was the quality Lyra had spent her whole life watching in people for whom seeing was not something they had been taught to fear. Aldrich was beside her in the way. He was almost always beside her, not performing presence, but simply present. His attention on their daughter in the grass, the early spring light across both of them. He said, "Her eyes did something just now." Lyra said, "Yes." He said, "Should I be concerned?" She said, "No." She said, "We have time." He looked at her. She looked at him. The silver was entirely absent from her eyes. It was a calm morning, and nothing was urgent. And she was exactly where she had chosen to be, and the gift had nothing pressing to say. He took her hand. The oracle's hall was open. The door was plain. Calla was at the intake desk with the thorough administrative efficiency that had characterized everything she did since the first week. The morning's first petitioner was already in the waiting room, sitting with the specific quality of someone who was carrying something difficult and had come to a place specifically designed for difficult things to be received without flinching. The door was open to anyone who needed it. The record was the record. And in the garden, in the early spring light, a small girl with silver-adjacent eyes pressed her palms flat to the earth and looked at everything in it with the complete and undefended attention of someone who had not yet been told that seeing accurately was something to fear. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.